Hi, my name is Wesley. I work as a software developer for Work & Co. We are a software product development agency. We have clients such as Nike, Disney, let's say Facebook also, and also other very nice initiatives like Planned Parenthood and breastcancer.org. And we help a lot of companies build a lot of great products, and sometimes we have some restrictions. So I'm going to talk today about how to bring components to legacy code, which is very similar to what Eric did to his company, but not necessarily using Angular. So how many times have you heard things like, you can't use React? We can't. It's just incompatible with our XYZ system. I can say that you can use, you just need to learn to adapt. And this is a talk about a way of doing that. First of all, let's define what a component is. A component is a software let's be a little more simple and say it's just a nice way to group and reuse code, right? We have a lot of great libraries, some older than others, but all of them have the concept of component. And some of them really use components, like React. Components bring reusability, it brings composition, it organizes your code a lot, and it's easy to implement, expand, scale, and as a lot of people say, it's easy to find people to work that want to work with React because it's modern and, all other things. And what is a legacy system? So I'm not talking about COBOL or mainframes or things like that. It's just something that already exists. It can be something that was created today or yesterday or last week or 3 years ago or something, but it's already running. It's too big to refactor. You can't remove it and just refactor everything. But if you have an opportunity to improve and scale, and you want to grow your team, you can just start to phase out the old systems and implement React. But it's also a restrictive system. So if you don't have a lot of control on whatever is generated, and everything is decided by a CMS or another backend system that needs some kind of composition ability and passing properties, and it will never work perfectly with the way React works, for instance, that's actually a restrictive system. Some examples, Magento and Drupal, so you can be running this on your backend. At Work & Co, we had a client that was using Oracle Hybris, which is a gigantic system for e-commerce, and they wanted to have the flexibility of that system that had a CMS inside. So we had to kind of move around and shuffle things, and we used the thing that I'm going to show you in a bit. Examples of companies that have old systems. Booking.com was founded in 1996. Their code base has Perl code from 1996 today running. And their JavaScript code base was mostly written in 2011. And they use jQuery. Meetup is a company from 2003, which is pretty old. And they also had a very old legacy system and not a lot of opportunities. And they started to phase everything out and start implementing React because Booking doesn't want to do this, but Meetup wanted to kind of bring modern technologies into the scene. So how does a typical framework behaves, right? So usually JavaScript sets the rules. And that looks like this. The HTML loads. That's fine, the JavaScript loads. And then the JavaScript defines exactly what needs to be done. And then after that, everything renders and behaviors added to the page. On React, I'm not considering a server-side rendering. That's it, like you have one div and then React will take over and do everything on that div. So you can't just have things around it or inside of it, it won't work. And this is how it works. You just say get that element and insert my whole application. And that app thing is megabytes of code. On jQuery, it's pretty similar in the sense that things are happening on the JavaScript. So you find an element and then you add behavior to that. If that element doesn't exist, nothing will happen because jQuery fails silently, which is terrible. But the element has to exist, and it's defined by the JavaScript. So all frameworks require some kind of element to exist in the page. Some of them require total control of the DOM for rendering or adding behavior. And they never expect, as far as I know, anything else to be running in parallel or to work together with anything else but themselves. So how does that restrictions work with the legacy system? You can replace the whole thing, as I said, with one application. And the system might want to customize things. So you can just say, oh, give me an API, I'll render everything. Because they'll say, no, we can only give you HTML. And this is a true story. So what do we do? If you have an opportunity, you have to check your strategy, make the decision, and say, OK, how much better would it be to have React on my system? If you have time, if you have resources, and you want to improve your code base, then you can choose to do this. You flip the responsibilities. So before you had JavaScript setting the rules, and now you have the DOM setting the rules. How does it look? So the HTML and JavaScript loads the same way, but the DOM indicates whatever needs to exist from React there, or any other framework that you're implementing. So then JavaScript acts on top of those requirements that they see and renders and adds behavior. An example using React, before React is controlling everything, and then afterwards you can have multiple things running at the same time, especially multiple React applications. So here's an example where you have a header and then a lot of code. So like in the middle, this is like an example of your legacy system. And then afterwards, you have another React component. And this one is receiving data from the CMS, let's say. And the good part here, similar to the way that ng React works, is that you say which component you want to render at that particular place. Right? And in this scenario, you say, oh, I want a header here. I don't care about anything that's after that. And then I want the post header here. And then with this tiny code, which is missing some things, but this is like the gist of it, you can accomplish that. First, you define your library of components. It's very important. Then you find all of the data component instances on your page. And for every one of those, you get which component needs to render and call render from React on that particular element in the page. So now is the time where nothing will go wrong. And I'm going to show an example. So this is an example of a legacy website with only HTML, but this could be a lot of jQuery and things like that. And I want to bring a navigation. So I already have this prepared here. And by the way, I'm using Create React App, which comes with live reloading and a lot of great things. So let's add the navigation. Immediately, you have a component here. And the navigation is actually a React component that is being initialized in this particular place. I added some items here. So in order to use those items, I receive them via props. Right? And then, just like any other day, you map and say, OK, I'm going to receive item. And I want to return a list item. You have to add a key. And please never use the index on an array. Always use something that is unique to that item so that React knows how to render if that changes. So item.url, and I think it's item.name for the place. So you had 2 things here. Now you have 3. I forgot to change the name. And there's it. And the great part about this is that you can still control. So this is kind of like emulating backend generated code. And you can just have as many components you need, and then it would just render individually. And this is the code. It has a little bit more things. It has to read prop elements somehow, and this is how I chose to do on a script element with JSON inside. And if the component doesn't exist, it will throw an error. And everything else is pretty much what I showed on the other slide. So in the end, data attributes are defining what needs to happen in the page, which components are present, what I need to do. And with this, you can have multiple systems running at the same time. You don't need to be worried about that. And if you have a strict backend, it can still personalize and mix and match the components that are on the page. So if you have like a product page and the client wants to put like a gallery instead of description, they can change that very easily using that system that they bought already. There are some caveats though. You have to understand the impacts of that framework because you are actually rendering multiple instances of that. For React, we didn't see absolutely no impact on the performance or on the timings. But the big impact was still parsing the JavaScript because React generates a lot of JavaScript. Bundling might be a challenge because you're actually bundling all of your components, and code splitting is not as straightforward as it could be. So you have to kind of add more data attributes to say which bundle that component is, for instance. But it's possible. And you, just like React doesn't care about state management outside of set state, you have to remember to share the state management between the React components outside of the components themselves. Just having a global Redux would be, a Redux star would be enough. And this is not just good for implementing React on old systems. It's also very good if you're just building a simple website with simple behavior or something very simple that you want to implement components. Because it helps organize your code in components, like using this data attribute approach. It adds flexibility on what you do, so like you can mix and match, again, everything that you have. And the footprint is very small. There's this library from a coworker of mine called Rafael Rinaldi. It's called Data Components. And it's just simply, it reads the data component, and then it finds it in a library and executes the function. And then from that on, you have access to the element, and you add your event listeners and do everything that you would do classically. But then this is kind of like 1 kilobyte gzipped, which is very small. You can find reference. I'll reply the NYC React Twitter handle, or you can find my Twitter here. And that's it. Thank you.
Thanks for the presentation. How do you deal with like global namespacing?
Well, for this thing, it's dealt by the imports using ES6, and then it's basically React itself. The only global things that I have running at this point is actually the document. This is the only document, the only global thing, like these things. So if you wanna, you might create this as a namespaced object and only run that object separate from your own code base. But in this scenario, everything that runs after is contained on React. So this is this like component list and collection. That would be the only thing that will be kind of global. And document.querySelector all.
So thanks, Wesley.
Thank you.